A common problem that we find today is that a lot of people don't understand the true meaning of liberalism.
Neoliberalism. And I want to acknowledge right at the start that I think neoliberalism is a garbage idea for garbage humans and that it's abhorrent by almost every theoretical and moral standard.
How he can claim it's so immoral to have liberty, yet what he supports is government theft and violence, forcing individuals into a collective group against their individual will, having forced them by stripping them of their individual rights, and then claiming that this is somehow moral.
Remember in episode 2 we talked about the link between liberalism and capitalism? Well, neoliberalism is like the twisted love child of the two. It likes finance, it likes low government spending, and it likes low taxes.
Yet he would rather support that of the government theft and violence, all in the name of paying for the public sector.
It does not like regulation, it does not like welfare, it does not like trade unions.
Capitalism isn't against that of unions as a whole, it's against the trade unions that you saw in Great Britain in the 20th century. Capitalism's not against welfare. It's all down to a question of, do you provide welfare through charity, in other words capitalism, which is moral because you're doing it voluntarily, or do you support welfare through government theft and violence? Capitalism's not against regulation. No. There's two types of regulation. There is that of government regulation, which is socialist because it's aiming to control the economy, and there is the market that regulates itself.
Neoliberalism is a capitalist ideology, so it likes free markets, but it doesn't just step back and let markets get on with it. Neoliberals actually use the state to create new markets, sometimes by privatizing public services, or just creating them where previously there weren't any, like carbon trading, which allows countries to purchase the right to pollute the atmosphere.
The big problem with his argument on the negative externalities is the fact that you face the issue that you will be punished if you harm that of another person's property, because that person has individual private property rights. It's supporting the free market by moving in that direction, but we do not live under a free market system today.
Like liberalism, neoliberalism loves the individual. Once the welfare state is eroded away, nobody's gonna write you a welfare check. You gotta take some personal responsibility. You gotta build the dream with your own two hands and your own hard work. If you had things like welfare, neoliberals say, then you would get lazy and dependent on handouts.
Again, it's one of these arguments. He just doesn't understand the history. He doesn't understand how you provide for people as an alternative to that. He thinks it's just a case of welfare through the state, and as if charity just doesn't exist.
Remember in episode 1 I said that liberalism loves freedom, and that every ideology loves freedom, but the devil is in who's allowed to have freedom and what exactly it amounts to? Well, neoliberalism loves freedom too, of a kind. For neoliberals, freedom for humans means freedom of the market. When markets are free, consumers can choose how to spend their wages. And that, neoliberals say, is what human freedom is all about.
I really do not understand why someone in their right mind would oppose the idea where consumers are free to shop around for their own goods and are able to determine prices, because that's essentially what that is. When you support consumer demand freely in the marketplace, being free to choose, being free to determine what they want and don't want, therefore it's down to the consumer that determines what value is, that determines what businesses are going to set their prices at. See, if you don't do that, you don't know what the consumer's needs and wants are.
Neoliberalism is very popular. It's an ideology held by just about every US president, even presidential candidate, and every UK Prime Minister since the 80s, as well as large parts of the EU, including the European Central Bank. So
I really don't understand his logic in terms of claiming that these prime ministers and presidents of the United States were somehow liberal, or that the European Union was liberal, when it was strongly anti-capitalist. And you can see that from their subsidies, etc. It's a regime that strongly regulates that of the private sector. It's against the entire meaning of liberalism. Who exactly was liberal? I mean, the closest you could look at was Ronald Reagan, and even that was pushing it. And that's the closest you would get of recent. But the last liberal, somewhat president of the United States was Calvin Coolidge, and that's going way back to the 1920s. So who else? You're arguing way before then. So there's nothing liberal about these, current presidents, etc. I wouldn't even call even Donald Trump that of being liberal. Sure, he supports things like the deregulation and perhaps lowering tax rates, and it can give him the benefit of the doubt. But supporting protectionist tariffs and stuff, this is exactly what I mean. People like him don't even understand the true meaning of liberalism to start with.
It emerged like a xenomorph in the UK under Thatcher and in the US under Reagan. Interestingly, Bill Clinton brought neoliberalism to the Democrats, and Tony Blair brought it to the British Labour Party.
And then he claims that Tony Blair, of all people, a warmongering, anti-capitalist, pro-corporatist socialist fool that he is, who took us to the war in Iraq, is somehow liberal.
Thatcher famously said, "There's no alternative." So much so that it came as a big shock when politicians like Jeremy Corbyn came along and pointed out that it's awful.
I've got to laugh at that one. This is the same Jeremy Corbyn who clearly doesn't have a clue, who praised the likes of Hugo Chavez. That's right, Hugo Chavez, who was responsible for dropping them from 99th on the Freedom Index right down to 174th. And now they're living under an oppressive communist regime with food shortage problems. They're living under hyperinflation because of all the socialism. The same Jeremy Corbyn who has the same idea of running the printing press.
Neoliberalism's love of deregulation contributed to the 2008 financial crisis.
This is another claim that really gets me, is this claim that capitalism was responsible for the banking crisis. There's no such thing as these bailouts under the capitalist system. When we go back to that of Margaret Thatcher, between 1979 to 1990, there was an increase of financial regulation. There was no deregulation as such. But in terms of that of the 2001 to 2012, the Financial Services Authority controlled your UK banking regulations, and their handbook was more than 10,500 pages long in regulations. That's right, your UK banking regulator had the banks over-regulated. So where did you get the information from to claim that there was deregulation?
Neoliberalism also led to austerity, the cuts to public services and wages, and tax breaks for the very wealthy.
The word austere means to live within your means. How the hell can you have an £18 billion overspend, which is a deficit, and somehow have austerity at the same time? Are you having a laugh? A cutback on spending is not the same thing as austerity.
It's also been noted that since austerity began, there's been a spike in the number of preventable deaths and suicides, which some researchers have said may be partly due to the cuts to the health service and social care. Caps on public sector pay and cuts to local authority budgets have also been blamed for events like the Grenfell fire, while cuts to social security have been blamed for the massive increase in the numbers of people having to use food banks.
So first of all, the NHS is just something that's always been inefficient, and that's due to the economic calculation problem, the knowledge problem, a government management problem due to price controls that led to the massive big long waiting lines, the hospital bed shortage problem, even long before the immigration crisis, and the issue with, surplus waste, the £7.6 billion being wasted every single year. You have to laugh at how rich this is, given the fact that his social security, the welfare state, all of the higher tax rates bankrupted the nation. Now, Britain sits with an £8.6 trillion debt level, and the largest contributing factor to Britain's £8.6 trillion debt level is all the unpaid pensions. That is to say, it's because of social security, because Britain can't afford it. And somehow, because you tell people these facts, they can't accept it. So the truth is, Britain's government's got no choice but to cut back. And it's not down to them, it's down to the creditors. So he doesn't understand that it's the creditors that control the money, that control the purse strings. And so it's not down to the government to choose on whether they increase spending or not. If they do, if the government was to ignore its creditors and increase the spending, the creditors would just simply punish them. They would increase the interest rates and force the government to finance the debt at a higher rate of interest. That's essentially what they would do. And you know who that would get passed off onto? It'd get passed off onto the taxpayer of society. So, or of course the creditors just could pack up and leave the country. And that would mean that your government would be left with no other choice but to run the printing press. Good luck with that, Jeremy Corbyn tactic. You'd end up facing hyperinflation like that of Venezuela.
Neoliberals say that it's quite a good way to create jobs. If you start giving businesses things like regulations and requiring them to pay people wages that they can actually survive on, then they're just going to take the jobs elsewhere. That's what neoliberals say. Anyway, many would actually disagree.
Businesses will go wherever there are lower tax rates, and see if you're hurting businesses through a minimum wage law, then yes, businesses will pack up and leave. That's essentially what they do. They'll do so because they have more incentive to earn profits elsewhere. And many businesses cannot afford the minimum wage. You force them to pay out for what it's not worth. And I could go into a whole entire argument on the minimum wage itself.
Because neoliberalism, like liberalism classic, assumes capitalism as a given, it's quite unwilling to consider job creation methods that are not capitalist.
I've got to laugh at that one, given the fact that government destroys more jobs than what it actually creates. Government cannot create jobs. Government is not a job creator.
You might also have some reservations about whether human lives can really be measured against economic benefit like that, especially when nowadays economic benefit basically just means rich people getting richer and everyone else working harder.
Again, I've covered that myth before in the antitrust laws video, explaining that in the 19th century that the wealth, gap remained relatively the same.
A good case study for neoliberalism is Iraq, because we forcibly imposed it when we invaded in 2003.
How the hell did you draw to the conclusion that the war in Iraq was something liberal when the liberal position is against war intervention?
Neoliberalism is very good at making rich people richer. Since the 80s, according to the IMF, more and more wealth has been concentrated in fewer and fewer hands.
During a period that Ronald Reagan would become president, that between 1975 to 1991, the bottom 20 percentile moved up the ladder by about $27,000 plus in wages, yet in the same time period, the rich only increased in wages by $4,000 plus, which completely contradicts that statement.
Neoliberals love free markets because they assume that a free market means competition. And they further assume that a competition means quality is kept high, prices are kept low, and it drives innovation and distributes resources efficiently to the people that want them the most. But it's not entirely clear that all of those assumptions are true, or at least simply true without qualification. For instance, have free markets resulted in a lot of competition everywhere? Or have some markets actually become dominated by a very small number of companies?
I don't know how you could possibly make that baseless claim, given the fact that we don't live under free markets today. And the baseless claim to say a lack of competition. And even again, you can turn your attention to the 19th century, and I've covered, videos on that before, and I've explained about there was no monopolies with the giant trusts and corporations, and the best part of all is that completely contradicts you, proven by the Consumer Price Index Again, it was continuously dropping.
Are resources as efficiently distributed as they could be? And do they always go to the people who want them the most? Is the innovation that's happening always useful? And is it allowed to benefit all of humankind when it is?
Well, given the fact that what you want to do is you want to interfere in market-driven prices, how then are you going to allocate scarce natural resources efficiently? You can't, because you wouldn't hold the information of profits and losses in order to do so. You'll never be able to cover everybody in terms of their needs and wants, and people's expectations far exceed what is actually available to them, and that's what scarcity means. You live in the real world where the study of economics came around because there is a scarcity, therefore we cannot provide for everyone's needs and wants. That's not what the study of economics is about. It's impossible to do so. And even if you provided for people, people still want after that, because people's expectations go far above that. You would never be able to fully satisfy everyone.
But really, the big trouble with this individualistic, market-based, personal responsibility approach is that some people can't navigate markets, particularly the job market, as effectively as everybody else. If you find it more difficult to obtain or stay in employment because of something like your race, your gender, or your ability, or if you can find employment but it doesn't pay you as much because there's a wage gap, or you face more workplace violence or discrimination, or you're in a group that it just costs more to be in because you've got, for instance, medical bills, well, neoliberalism has no solutions to any of that.
Again, that's completely false, because what you are basing that off of is today's standards, as if to say that American healthcare costs would be what they are today under a free market. It just simply is not true. If America moved towards that of a free market economy, their healthcare costs would dramatically fall, and their cost of living would be dirt cheap. They would be far richer as a society. So that myth goes flying right out the window. And even at that, it's like, how are they being stopped? Because there's so much opportunity in a free market for everyone to go and do what they want. And even for people who are disabled, it becomes down to the whole issue that these people are provided for. It's not like welfare just doesn't exist. The way that people such as yourself paint a free market is like, a big cloud of darkness comes over the top and they're just left there to die. It just isn't the case.
And this whole personal responsibility shtick ignores the fact that at some point in every human being's life, we require care. We require something we need that is just freely given. Maybe that's the care of a parent, or a friend, or maybe it's a nurse or a doctor or a waiter going above and beyond just what they're paid to do in order to just freely make your life that little bit better.
Again, how rich of you to talk about care when your NHS costs more than £120 billion per year, where you drove the costs of living through the roof, you drove the debt level through the roof, you crippled people in this country with a soaring, massive debt problem, where eventually it's all going to come crashing down, and it will come crashing down heavy on people.
Care is unselfish, and trying to ground something that is definitionally unselfish in market systems that reward being selfish is just not going to work.
So, you talk about selfish. What do you call taking away an individual's rights for you to think that your right is somehow greater than my right to disagree? That is selfish. That's you thinking that your rights are somehow greater than mine. Now, I am an individual who has the right to disagree, and every individual, because we believe in negative rights, which means equal rights, the right to freely agree to disagree. Therefore, as an individual, I believe that I should be able to work and earn 100% of my earnings, and not be infringed upon and have money stolen from me by a government. Now, that's the bottom line of it. You support something immoral that requires government theft and violence. to force people into a collective group to pay for that universal healthcare system, and somehow you think it's not selfish that you think your rights are somehow greater than that of the rights of people to disagree. So how about this system then that would make it fairer? How about in this society we give people the option to opt out of the income tax? Because see, if that option never came around, a lot of people would just drop the income tax and your NHS would collapse, and you know fine well that you require forcing that out of people's hands in order to pay for it. And again, that's your own self-interest, your selfish needs over and above that of other people who disagree.
The study of care and how it impacts our political and economic systems is its own branch of philosophy. It's called care ethics, and neoliberalism just has nothing to say about that.
That's false. Saying that, people who support a free market just do not care, it's just a baseless claim that's not even based on reality. Again, it's just one of these things that you just make a claim, hope that it sticks, and therefore that somehow constitutes as an argument when it doesn't.
Neoliberals assume that freedom means consuming products in a way that maximizes profit for business and financial capital. Maybe you can think of some other ways in which you might like to be free. This quote from Helen Sugar summarizes neoliberalism quite nicely and more dispassionately than I can. Neoliberalism ascribes virtually all responsibility for personal and social welfare to the individual, which is further articulated as crucial to individual liberty under the auspices of choice. Importantly, this individual choice is tightly linked with consumption, to the extent that individuals are expected to choose with their dollars. Under this framework, the practical role of government is to facilitate the market. Moreover, government intervention at any level, in the form of social services for instance, or with respect to the regulation of industry, is represented as cultivating or enabling dependence.
Well, there goes that entire argument, because without that of consumer demand, you wouldn't have the information of profits and losses. You would not hold the information of what people's needs and wants are. Now, your belief that it should not be down to the consumer to freely choose is basically saying that you believe in central planning, that somehow you think a set group of people sitting in a central government know better about people's needs and wants than the people do themselves. So how the hell is a set group of people sitting in a central government going to know people's needs and wants of about 1,000,000,001 different products out there on the market? I mean, you could go to one clothing store alone where there's about 100 different clothing styles, different colours, different material, and just different makes. And you go through all of those different options. How the hell do you know how much to produce of each and every single one of those without the consumer's demand? You've got no way of knowing that. And the only way you can ever convey that is through prices. And who is it that conveys the prices? Consumers. Because they're the ones who walk into the store and freely choose what they want to buy. You can then tell what consumers want and what they don't want. If consumers are not buying a product, you know fine well what you're not going to use more of. So you're not going to use those resources. You're not going to produce more of those products because you know the consumer's not buying it. But if you take that away, if you take away the consumer's demand, how the hell are you supposed to know that? You don't. That's why the Soviet Union ended in the terror that it did. That's why it ended with the surplus waste. That's why it ended up with the shortage problems. That's why, when the likes of Gorbachev got sight of the United States of America with food lined on their shelves, he was gobsmacked. So that's the entire problem with that argument. I mean, it's this idea that somehow a set group of people sitting in a central government know better. Another part of that problem is that it's the issue that value is subjective. And since value is something subjective, you don't know what people want and don't want. And the other part of the issue is that value changes with time. Just because people want something now doesn't mean to say they want it 6 months from now. And things change as technology improves. I may want something now, but 5 months from now, for all I know, something better could come out. And therefore the value changes. Whereas what you believe in is fixing a price, and somehow that price and value is knowable. Value isn't something knowable. It changes all the time. And that's why your entire argument goes flying out the window, because you have no common sense.